Welcome to Why Knowledge Matters. Welcome, Professor Sharma. You mentioned transformation of heart. Now, this seems to be key. Now, one could argue that this has been a very particular case, and Mahatma Gandhi has been a very particular, extraordinary person. How would you say this and his political stance of non-violence would or can be applied in today's current political climate, whether this is in North America or in other parts of the world?
This is a very good question. Let us look at some of these more absurd suggestions from our commonsensical point of view. That the Jews should allow themselves to be killed by Hitler. That the Hindus should allow themselves to be killed by the Muslims in the riots. Isn't it absurd? But when Gandhi was told this, he said, they will leave behind an imperishable example. Now, the position opposite to Mahatma Gandhi was taken by Golda Meir of Israel, when she said, I will not allow Israel to be destroyed so that the world may speak well of it. So we see what the stakes are. But what Gandhi is saying is that even if in one case, through our sacrifices, we can demonstrate to the world the actual benefits of resolving such a conflict non-violently, its appeal would seem so natural. Suppose somehow, by some stroke, the Palestinians and the Jews managed to strike a deal non-violently. Do you think Hindus and Muslims can go on fighting? Or India or Pakistan can go on fighting? When they will say both of them flourishing, Israel and Palestine side by side, why don't we also do this? The whole world will change. Actually, I have no doubt about this. The benefits will be so obvious. And so it is worth the risk. If the guy had said, no, I'm going to kill the guy, the first man who decided to allow the intruder to be handed over to the police. If his nerve had failed, you would never be able to see the benefits. And remember, in his case, two families will benefit, his own and that of the accused. They won't lose a person if he's not killed in revenge, and so on. Though he could, of course, be sentenced to death, so there's another issue. The benefits will be so obvious. If you can, once you can achieve. Look at the case of India and Britain. The relationships between India and Britain as they are now would have been impossible if it had been a military struggle to the kind of difficulties Algeria and France had for so long. You remember that? So it's a revolutionary shift in a paradigm of problem solving. The thing to keep in mind is that the apparent loser will lose less. than otherwise.
Now, if we will leave out politics, I think everyone would subscribe to this proposition that Gandhi put forward. It's an incredible, inspiring story. What would you see, and how do you separate spirituality and religion from what Gandhi did? Now, from these two perspectives, and would you separate the two,
Yes,
spirituality and religion? And if so,
well,
how?
let's see. Let's look at what the basic psychology, human psychology, which Gandhi is working on. Gandhi's basic idea was that in order to transform somebody's heart, you must be ready to undergo voluntary suffering. I'll give you an almost crude example, or you might even consider it trivial, but I'm a professor. If a young lady comes to me and says, I need an extension because I've had these problems and all that, that is one young girl comes to me and says, I will start discussing it with her. What were the problems? Don't you think you should reconsider? So on. A second young lady comes in and bursts into tears about some trouble she has been having. What would be my reaction? Different, right? Why? The language of suffering is more eloquent than words. She has displayed suffering. She's crying. You can call it voluntary suffering, crying on her own, right? She's subjecting herself to suffering. And that has transformed my attitude. Gandhi believed that every human being was human enough that at some point this dialectic will come into play. So your voluntary suffering, the extent to which you are prepared to undergo voluntary suffering, is your test. And you should be prepared to die for it also. Gandhi was not so naive that he thought people will roll over. Right? He knew that when long-standing vested interests are at stake, people will resist. There will be conflict. Blood will be shed. The only question Gandhi asked was, whose blood should it be? Should it rather not be your blood as the more mature side to the conflict? Than the other person. Through your voluntary suffering, you have set out to transform the heart of the other party. Now, this was an act or a matter of faith for Gandhi, that every human being is a human being. So at some point, your voluntary suffering is going to activate his humanity, his or her humanity. And that is why I was prepared to die. Now you call it spirituality, you call it morality, call it human psychology, call it political shrewdness. You see, this is a very tricky thing. Once, one of his disciples, this happened in, I think, 1946, somewhere around that time, the Muslim girl, Attu Salam, even her name is known. She went with him in a region where Hindus and Muslims had been at each other for a while. And it was a Muslim majority area. So Gandhi followers fanned out in the various villages. She ended up in a village which was Muslim majority. There was a Hindu minority, and they had a temple of the goddess. And there are two swords, decorative swords hung on the walls. And in the disturbances, they had been removed by the Muslims. So this young lady, Amtu Salam, said, we should live in peace. Hindus and Muslims should live in peace. Same God, two religions, but preach the same thing. So why don't you return those two as a gesture of goodwill? They said, no, who are you? They behaved in a manner towards her which we would regard as high-handed and arrogant. So she kept listening to them. Then finally she said, if you don't accept my request, then I'll stop taking food. They said, you can do whatever you like. Then she said, if you won't respond to my request, then I'll stop taking water. Again, they said, do whatever. So she lay down on a cot in front of the mosque. Message flashed to Gandhi. This is what has happened. Gandhi sent her a note. The note said, drink water. Give God time to work his miracle. So she started drinking water. On the fourth day, the entire village was prostrate before her, willing to do anything she said. This is the Gandhian technique. You undergo voluntary suffering, there's a change of heart, there is a genuine resolution of the issue. Nobody has won, nobody has lost. Both sides are transformed. It's a very profound message.
You mentioned very eloquently how the socialization process went on if you look back, and your illustration is really important to see how struggles actually will ultimately play out and pay out for the common good. How would you answer to questions of socialization that we still suffer tremendous wars, like just the Israel-Palestine conflict, and how can we help as individuals to actually forge this process in order to achieve what Gandhi always tried to achieve, that was to change society and hearts in a non-violent way?
But we have to reflect on our earlier example of how have we been socialized not to take revenge. We are told throughout our life at school about law and order, civic duties. Yeah. We are familiarized with the institution of the police. We meet policemen. So that our whole thinking is shaped in that way. And that is, And so, the education is the secret, how we educate the people. If we tell them, look, there will be differences. People will cheat, but make a court case, don't stab the guy. Even if he has robbed you of your entire life savings, take him to court. Right? So this is how we are socialized, and we have specialists in law. So we'll have to train people specialize in non-violent resolution. And the educators then, just as the senior generation has realized that no matter how grave, how justified, how profound your reason for revenge is, you cannot take it. Court. Similarly, no matter for how many years one country has exploited another country or ruled over another country, or one section of society has made life hell for another section of society, the one thing you cannot do is seek a violent resolution. See, but the Truth and Reconciliation Committee in South Africa is the real way of following upon Gandhi. And it disclosed us a further detail of the Gandhian dialectic. And what was that detail? There were 4 policemen white policemen, who openly confessed in a gathering of blacks that they had killed black protesters, black prisoners, sorry. They openly confessed and cried. Now what happens when that happens is that the victim suddenly starts feeling that I'm also a human being. He's being human, right? He did this, he's repentant, he's crying. I'm also a fallible human being. I may have a genuine grievance, but I know that human beings can genuinely go wrong. So I should be forgiving. You'll be amazed how often when people complain of, how others have treated them and so on, the apology, the confession, the admission diffuses the situation. Because of this, the dynamic shifts. And there might be an apology, or there might be even some compensation, but the whole manner in which that is being resolved changes the complexion of the case. And you asked about spirituality and all that. The person who described this scene in South Africa ended this whole incident, his report on the incident, with the last line, God was in that room. If you want to be very rational about it, these are totally human processes. Right? The way we discuss them, human psychology, human responses, and so on. So maybe in that sense there is no God. But there's a transcendence of the existing situation. And in as much as religion is a celebration of transcendence, it becomes a religious or spiritual occasion.
I think this is so interesting, because I think there seems also a gap between the individual and the collective. And so
Exactly.
to engineer it not engineering, but to solve the problem like at the individual level, it might be possible. But then you have also this whole dynamic when groups come into play. And then we also know from there that people change behavior based on the situation. And so then it becomes very complicated to actually implement what Gandhi also said, even though one might be conscious about the consequences that I shall not take revenge, for example. How do you respond to this, that it is, or it can be extremely tricky, especially if there are more people involved?
But, sir, if panic can spread, courage can also be contagious. You remember the name of Aquino, the Philippine leader in the age of Marcos? This comment has been attributed to him, I think. In any case, he was killed on his arrival in Philippines. When he came to fight in the election, he was a rival of Marcos, and he knew he would be killed. Sort of, he feared or anticipated. But he came, he was killed. What happened? Marcos lost to Mrs. Aquino. You see? No violent revolution, but regime change.
Now, we are almost at the end. You said an act of faith, and it seems, especially in our contemporary world, we lose more and more faith in history or in historical processes, because if you look at history in retrospect, we clearly see how fruitful so many actions were of people such as Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and so on. What would you suggest to people today, especially also young people, how to challenge regimes and problems that we face, whether it's in Canada or elsewhere?
You see, if we get bogged down in history, then we will never get out of it. Let's go back to the case of the intruder who kills your children. If you keep agonizing over the death of your children, the new vision which you have of resolution of interpersonal disputes, will have great difficulty in emerging. That is why people accuse Gandhi of lacking a sense of history. But now you see what he was saying. He was saying the problem with our history is that if there are two brothers and they have great differences and they resolve them peacefully, they will never go down in history. But they killed each other, there will be a chapter in the history book.
That's a very interesting point. Absolutely. Now, obviously, it's also very dangerous at times that if we forget history, obviously, that's not your point. I think, obviously, it's about reconciliation, as you just mentioned, how important it is and how important it is to really move forward into a more peaceful area of our times. Now, to conclude, could you give us your favorite author or book and your wishes for the future, within Gandhi's thought?
You will forgive an element of self-promotion in what I'm going to say, okay? But the first book I would recommend to people who want to really know more about Gandhi is Louis Fisher's The Life of Mahatma Gandhi. It's an old classic. those who are interested in my interpretation of Gandhi might wish to read my own book, Gandhi, a Spiritual Biography, in which I spell this all out.
And the last word, what you can give us that we ought to take from Gandhi in 2 or 3 sentences?
Well, there's a famous line, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind.
Professor Arvind Sharma, it has been a blessing to have you on our show. Thank you so much.
It has been a privilege for me to be on your show. Thank you.
Arvind Sharma. And just as an aside, please check out his books. He is one of the foremost scholars in the field and highly, highly recommended. Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye.